Prisons are supposedly safe places, but that's not always the case. Some of the most perverse minds ever known are their final fates, not by the hands of the law, but by other inmates. Discover the mysteries behind the most shocking deaths inside cells, and see how karma can be ruthless. Leroy Martin. Leroy Martin, also known as the Gaffney Strangler, was a serial killer who terrorized Gaffney, South Carolina, in the late 1960s. Born in 1937, Martin began his series of murders in 1967, killing for women in a short period. He strangled his victims, who were usually young women he lured to isolated locations. The case gained notoriety when Martin began calling a local journalist, providing disturbing details about the murders and the location of the bodies. This eventually helped the police track down and capture Martin, who was arrested in February 1968. Death in prison. Leroy Martin was murdered in the maximum security prison in Columbia, South Carolina. On May 20, 1972, he was stabbed to death by another inmate, David Francis, during a fight in the cafeteria. Francis claimed he killed Martin as an act of revenge for the lives he had taken. Charles Schmid. Charles Schmid, also known as the Pied Piper of Tucson, was an American serial killer who committed his crimes in Tucson, Arizona, during the 1960s. Born on July 8, 1942, Schmid was known for his charisma and eccentric behavior, which included wearing heavy makeup and thick-soled shoes to appear taller. Between 1964 and 1965, Schmid killed at least 3 young women. He lured his victims with his charm and killed them in brutal circumstances. His case was notorious for how he bragged about his crimes to friends, many of whom initially didn't believe him. Eventually, one of his friends went to the police, leading to Schmid's arrest. Death in prison. Charles Schmid was murdered in the Florence State Penitentiary, Arizona, on March 30, 1975. He was stabbed multiple times by 2 other inmates, Richard Bruntz and Raymond Hudgens, who claimed that Schmid was arrogant and unbearable. After the attack, Schmid survived for 20 days before succumbing to his injuries. James Whitey Bulger. James Whitey Bulger was a notorious organized crime boss in Boston, Massachusetts, and one of the FBI's most wanted criminals. Born on September 3, 1929, Bulger led the Winter Hill Gang and was involved in a variety of criminal activities, including extortion, drug trafficking, and murders during the 1970s and 1980s. He was also an FBI informant, which allowed him to operate with impunity for many years. In 1994, after being tipped off about an impending federal indictment, Bulger fled and managed to evade authorities for 16 years, becoming one of the most wanted fugitives in the United States. He was finally captured in 2011 in Santa Monica, California, and convicted of 11 murders, among other crimes. Death in prison. On October 30, 2018, James Whitey Bulger was murdered at the federal prison in Hazleton, West Virginia, just hours after his arrival. He was beaten to death with a padlock wrapped in a sock by other inmates, including Foscio's Freddie Guess, a former mobster with ties to the mafia. It is believed that Bulger was targeted due to his past as an informant and his notoriety. Thoris Christensen. Thoris Christensen was born in Denmark by December 28, 1957, but emigrated to the United States as a child with his family. They settled in Solvang, California, a small town with strong Danish influence. During his teenage years, Christensen developed a morbid obsession with violent deaths and necrophilia, which eventually led him to become a serial killer. Christensen committed his first murders between 1976 and 1977, focusing on young college students in California. He would approach his victims, usually offering them a ride, and then take them to isolated locations where he would shoot them. After the murders, he frequently mutilated the bodies and, in some cases, kept them for necrophilic purposes. His series of crimes ended in 1979 when one of his victims, Lydia Preston, survived the attack. She was able to identify Christensen, leading to his arrest and subsequent conviction. Christensen was sentenced to life in prison, death in prison. On March 30, 1981, Thoris Christensen was stabbed to death by another inmate at Folsom State Prison in California. The identity of the killer was never officially disclosed, and the motivations for the crime remain obscure. There are speculations that the attack may have been motivated by gang rivalry or personal resentments, but it was never fully clarified. Jose Antonio Rodriguez Vega. Jose Antonio Rodriguez Vega was born on December 3, 1957, in Santander, Spain. He had a difficult childhood and grew up in an environment marked by violence and poverty. In his teenage years, he began committing minor crimes, but his propensity for violence only fully manifested in adulthood. Vega became known as El Matavillas, the granny killer, for his choice of victims, elderly women who lived alone. Between 1987 and 1988, he raped and murdered at least 16 women in the Cantabria region of Spain. Vega would usually gain the trust of his victims before brutally attacking them. After the murders, he often robbed the victims' houses, taking small valuable items as souvenirs of his crimes. His capture occurred in 1988, when the police intensified investigations after an increase in suspicious deaths among elderly women. A search of his house revealed objects belonging to the victims, leading to his arrest and conviction. He was sentenced to 440 years in prison. Death in prison. On October 24, 2002, Rodriguez Vega was brutally murdered in Topaz Prison, Salamanca. Two other inmates, who expressed their disgust for Vega due to the nature of his crimes, planned and executed the assassination. They stabbed Vega several times and then crushed his head with a cement block, killing him instantly. The attack was so violent that Vega was declared dead on the spot, and the killers were subsequently convicted of his murder, although they were already serving long sentences. Leopold Diyan. Leopold Diyan was born on February 25, 1920, in Quebec, Canada. He already had a criminal record before becoming a serial killer, including sexual abuse crimes. In 1950, Diyan was convicted of rape, but was paroled in 1963, a decision that would later be harshly criticized. After his release, he resumed his criminal activities, which this time escalated to homicides. Between March and April 1963, Diyan kidnapped, sexually abused, and murdered 4 boys in the Quebec region. He lured the victims with promises of giving them money or rights, and then attacked them. The brutality of his crimes shocked Canada, and he was quickly captured and sentenced to death in 1963. However, his sentence was later commuted to life imprisonment. Death in prison. On November 17, 1972, Leopold Diyan was murdered in Quebec Penitentiary by Normand Lawrence Champagne, a young prisoner with whom Diyan shared a cell. Champagne had a history of aggressive behavior and apparently developed a deep hatred for Diyan, especially after learning the details of the heinous crimes he had committed. Champagne stabbed Diyan to death, later stating that he did it out of revenge and revulsion for Diyan's actions against children. Champagne was tried and convicted for this murder, but his act was seen by some as a form of justice within the penitentiary system. Donald Harvey. Donald Harvey, known as the Angel of Death, was one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. Born on April 15, 1952, Harvey worked as a nursing assistant in hospitals in Ohio and Kentucky. During his career, he claimed to have killed between 37 and 57 people, although the actual number could be even higher. Harvey claimed that many of his victims were terminal patients and that he was relieving their suffering, but many of his murders seemed to be motivated by anger or desire for power. He used various methods, including poisoning with cyanide, insulin, and other medications, as well as suffocation. Harvey was finally arrested in 1987 when the examination of a patient revealed high levels of cyanide, leading to the discovery of his long series of crimes. Death in prison. Donald Harvey was murdered at Toledo State Prison in Ohio on March 30, 2017. He was beaten to death by another prisoner, James Elliott. Harvey was found severely injured in his cell and died 2 days later in the hospital. The reasons behind the attack were not fully clarified, but his notoriety as one of the country's most infamous serial killers may have contributed to his death. Richard Lob. Richard Lob, along with Nathan Leopold, was responsible for one of the most notorious crimes of the 1920s in the United States. Born on June 11, 1905, Lob was an intelligent young man from a wealthy family in Chicago. He and Leopold, who shared an obsession with superior intellect and the idea of committing the perfect crime, kidnapped and murdered Bobby Franks, a 14-year-old boy, in 1924. The case shocked the country only for the brutality of the crime, but also for the fact that it was committed by 2 young men from wealthy and influential families. Both were captured when circumstantial evidence linked Leopold to glasses left at the crime scene. They confessed to the murder and were sentenced to life in prison. Death in prison. Richard Lob was murdered at Joliet State Penitentiary in Illinois on January 28, 1936. He was attacked by a fellow inmate, James Day, with a razor blade. Day claimed that Lob had made unwanted sexual advances, which led to the fatal attack. Lob died due to his injuries, while Day claimed self-defense and ended up being acquitted of the murder charge. Albert D Solvo. Albert D Solvo became known as the Boston Strangler, accused of murdering 13 women in the Boston area between 1962 and 1964. Born on September 3, 1931, D Solvo had a history of petty crimes before becoming the main suspect in the murders. His victims were usually single women who lived alone, and he strangled them after gaining access to their homes, often posing as a maintenance worker or salesman. D Solvo confessed to the crimes while in prison on rape charges, although some question the veracity of his confession. He was never tried for the murders, but was convicted of other crimes and sentenced to life in prison. Death in prison. Albert D Solvo was murdered at Walpole State Prison in Massachusetts on November 25, 1973. He was stabbed to death in his cell, and the circumstances of his death remain obscure. It is believed that D Solvo was killed by other inmates due to the nature of his crimes, although authorities never officially identified the responsible party. Jeffrey Dahmer. Jeffrey Dahmer, known as the Milwaukee Cannibal, was one of the most infamous serial killers in the United States. Born on May 21, 1960, Dahmer committed his crimes between 1978 and 1991. He murdered 17 young men and boys, many of whom he lured with promises of money or alcohol. Dahmer not only killed his victims, but also practiced necrophilia and cannibalism with their bodies. He was finally captured in 1991, when one of his victims managed to escape and lead the police to Dahmer's apartment, where incredibly disturbing evidence was found, including human body parts. Dahmer was tried and sentenced to 15 life sentences without the possibility of parole. Death in prison. Jeffrey Dahmer was murdered on November 28, 1994, at the Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage, Wisconsin. He was beaten to death by another inmate, Christopher Scarver, while performing work duties in prison. Scarver claimed he killed Dahmer because of the horrible crimes he had committed, and also because Dahmer allegedly provoked other prisoners with references to his crimes. Scarver also killed another inmate, Jesse Anderson, in the same attack. So, which of these did you find the most bizarre? Comment below, and see you in the next video.